Picture this. It's 480 BCE, and the fate of Western civilization hangs by a thread at a narrow mountain pass in Greece. 300 Spartans and their allies stand against the mightiest empire the world has ever seen. We all know how this story ends. Leonidas falls, the pass is taken, and the Persians march south. But what if it hadn't happened that way? What if those bronze shields had held firm, those spears had never broken, and Xerxes had been forced to retreat in shame? Today, we're diving into one of history's most fascinating what-ifs, a scenario where the hot gates never fell, and how that single change could have rewritten the entire story of human civilization. The summer of 480 BCE was unlike any other in the ancient world. Across the Hellespont, the greatest military machine ever assembled was on the move. King Xerxes of Persia had spent years preparing for this moment. The humiliation his father Darius had suffered at Marathon still burned in the royal memory, and now the time for revenge had come. This wasn't just another campaign. This was the culmination of Persian imperial ambition, a carefully orchestrated invasion designed to bring all of Greece under the Persian yoke once and for all. The numbers were staggering. Ancient sources speak of millions of soldiers, though modern historians estimate the Persian force at somewhere between 120,000 and 300,000 men. Either way, it was a host unlike anything the Greek world had ever faced. Immortals from Persia, archers from Syria, cavalry from Bactria, marines from Phoenicia. The empire itself was marching west, a living tide of bronze and steel that seemed unstoppable. Supply depots had been established across the route. Massive pontoon bridges spanned the Hellespont. Even a canal had been dug through the Athos Peninsula to allow the Persian fleet safe passage. Nothing had been left to chance. Against this overwhelming force stood the fractured, quarreling city-states of Greece. Athens and Sparta, the two great powers, were natural rivals who could barely agree on the time of day, let alone coordinate a defense. The smaller states watched nervously from the sidelines, many already calculating which way the wind was blowing. Some, like Thebes, had already thrown in their lot with the Persians. Others sent token forces while keeping their main armies at home. It seemed impossible that such a divided coalition could stand against the unified might of the Persian Empire. Yet the Greeks had something the Persians lacked. They knew their own ground. When the Persian host finally reached the borders of central Greece, they found their path blocked by a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates. Here, between towering cliffs and the restless sea, the road south narrowed to barely the width of a cart track. It was the perfect defensive position, a place where a few disciplined warriors could hold off an army many times their size. King Leonidas of Sparta understood this immediately. While his compatriots celebrated religious festivals that prevented them from marching in full force, he gathered his personal guard of 300 picked men. These weren't young recruits fresh from training. They were veterans, fathers with sons to carry on their bloodlines, men who knew this mission would likely end in death. Alongside them came allies from across Greece, 700 Thespians who volunteered to stay to the end, 400 Thebans whose loyalty was suspect, but whose presence was required, contingents from a dozen smaller cities, bringing the total Greek force to around 7,000 men. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, the greatest empire in the world, its banners stretching to the horizon, its supply trains rumbling with the wealth of a dozen nations. On the other, a small band of Greeks standing in a narrow pass, their bronze armor glinting in the morning sun, their long spears forming an impenetrable hedge of death. But what made this moment so crucial wasn't just the military reality. It was what each side represented. The Persian Empire, for all its might and grandeur, was fundamentally different from the Greek world. It was a top-down hierarchy where power flowed from the god-king Xerxes down through layers of satraps and governors to the common soldiers. Individual initiative was discouraged. Conformity was prized. The empire's strength lay in its ability to mobilize vast resources and coordinate the efforts of dozens of different peoples under a single will. Greece was chaos by comparison. Each city-state jealously guarded its independence. Citizens argued in assemblies, voted on laws, and questioned their leaders. Athens was experimenting with something called democracy, where even common farmers could have a say in government. Sparta had created a warrior society, unlike anything the world had ever seen, where discipline and honor were valued above life itself. These weren't subjects bowing before a throne. These were free men fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life. The clash at Thermopylae was therefore much more than a battle between two armies. It was a collision between two fundamentally different visions of how human society should be organized. Would the future belong to imperial unity and centralized control, or to the messy, chaotic but vibrant world of independent city-states? Would humanity's destiny be shaped by the commands of god-kings, or by the voices of citizens debating in the marketplace? When the first Persian attacks began, the answer seemed obvious. How could 7,000 Greeks, no matter how brave or disciplined, stand against the endless waves of Persian soldiers? The Medes came first, confident in their numbers and their reputation. They crashed against the Greek line like waves against a cliff, their wicker shields splintering on bronze, their short spears unable to reach past the forest of Greek spear points. Behind them came the Immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, 10,000 strong and supposedly invincible. They too were thrown back, their formation breaking apart in the narrow confines of the pass. For 2 days, the pattern repeated. Wave after wave of Persian attacks met the unmovable wall of Greek bronze and iron. The pass became a charnel house, littered with Persian dead, while the Greek line held firm. Xerxes watched from his golden throne, leaping to his feet in rage as his best troops were repelled by a handful of Greeks. The impossible was happening. The unstoppable Persian war machine had been stopped cold, but then came the betrayal that would seal the fate of the 300. A local Greek named Ephialtes, seeking Persian gold, revealed the existence of a goat path through the mountains that would allow the Persians to attack the Greeks from behind. As dawn broke on the third day, Leonidas realized the trap was closing. The Immortals were descending from the mountain path, while the main Persian force prepared for another frontal assault. The Greeks were about to be caught in a vice from which there could be no escape. This was the moment that would echo through eternity. In our timeline, Leonidas made the fateful decision that would immortalize him in legend. He dismissed most of his allies, keeping only his 300 Spartans and a handful of volunteers for a last stand that would buy precious time for the Greek fleet to escape. The final battle was brief and brutal. Surrounded and outnumbered, the defenders fought to the last man, selling their lives dearly but ultimately falling beneath a storm of Persian arrows. But what if that mountain path had never been revealed? What if Ephialtes had remained loyal, or had been discovered before he could reach the Persian camp? What if the 300 had held not for 3 days, but for 3 weeks or 3 months? The ripple effects of such a change would have been staggering, reshaping not just the ancient world, but the entire course of human history. Picture the scene if that betrayal had never come. The third dawn breaks over Thermopylae, and instead of being surrounded, the Greek line still holds firm. Xerxes, watching from his throne, faces a reality no Persian king had ever confronted. His supposedly invincible army, the terror of nations, has been stopped dead by a few thousand Greeks in bronze armor. The implications would have been immediate and catastrophic for the Persian war machine. You see, the Persian Empire wasn't just fighting a military campaign, it was fighting time itself. That massive army, with its hundreds of thousands of soldiers and camp followers, was a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. Every day they remained in one place. They consumed tons of supplies: grain, meat, water, fodder for the horses and pack animals. The longer they stayed at Thermopylae, battering uselessly against that unbreakable Greek wall, the more their supply lines stretched and strained. The Persian fleet, shadowing the army along the coast, faced its own mounting problems. The narrow waters around Artemisium had already cost them dearly in storms and skirmishes with the Greek navy. Now, with the army stalled indefinitely at the hot gates, the fleet found itself trapped in hostile waters with no clear mission. Should they attempt to force a landing south of the pass, risk everything on a desperate assault against prepared Greek positions, the Persian admirals, accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through sheer numbers, suddenly found themselves in an impossible strategic bind. But the real crisis wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Throughout the Persian Empire, from the dusty roads of Mesopotamia to the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, the word spread like wildfire. The great king's army had been stopped, not defeated in some grand battle where they could claim the enemy had superior numbers or better ground, stopped cold by a handful of Greeks who refused to bow down. For an empire built on the myth of Persian invincibility, this was more dangerous than losing a dozen battles. Back in Greece, the news would have electrified the wavering city-states. Those who had been calculating the odds, wondering whether to resist or submit, suddenly saw a different possibility. If 300 Spartans could hold off the entire Persian army, what could all of Greece accomplish united? The psychological impact would have been enormous. Cities that had already sent earth and water to Xerxes as tokens of submission might have reconsidered. Neutral states might have thrown their weight behind the Greek cause. Even some of those fighting for Persia might have begun to question their choice. Imagine Xerxes facing this impossible situation. Every day at Thermopylae cost him not just supplies and men, but prestige and authority. Back home in Persepolis, his satraps would be receiving reports of the stalemate with growing concern. Revolts that had been simmering beneath the surface might suddenly flare into open rebellion. Egypt, always restless under Persian rule, might see this as the moment to strike for independence. The Greek cities of Ionia, conquered by his father, might rise in coordinated revolt. The great king would have faced an agonizing choice: retreat, and admit that the mighty Persian Empire could be stymied by a few thousand Greeks, continue the assault, and watch his army bleed away in futile attacks against an impregnable position, or try to find another way around, burning precious weeks while his empire began to fracture behind him. But let's say Xerxes chose to withdraw. The humiliation would have been absolute. The army that had crossed the Hellespont in triumph would now be retreating with its tail between its legs, pursued not by a victorious enemy army, but by its own failure. The retreat itself would have been a catastrophe. Hungry, demoralized troops struggling back across hostile territory, while local populations, emboldened by Persian weakness, harassed their columns and cut off stragglers. The psychological shockwaves would have reverberated across the ancient world. In Egypt, the old pharaonic families would have seen their chance to throw off the Persian yoke. In Babylon, the ancient priesthoods would have whispered that the gods had turned against the Persians. From India to the Black Sea, subject peoples would have looked at their Persian overseers with new eyes. The empire that had seemed eternal and unshakable would suddenly appear vulnerable, mortal, defeatable. In Greece itself, the implications would have been even more profound. A successful defense of Thermopylae wouldn't just have saved the southern city-states from invasion, it would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Greek world. Sparta, already respected for its military prowess, would have achieved a reputation bordering on the supernatural. The 300 who held the pass would have become living legends, proof that Spartan discipline and courage could overcome any odds. But here's where it gets really interesting. In our timeline, the Greek victory at Salamis and Plataea came at enormous cost. Athens was burned, thousands died, and the Greek world was left economically devastated. A victory at Thermopylae would have prevented all of that. The Greek cities would have been preserved intact, their populations unscathed, their treasuries unplundered. Instead of spending the next decade rebuilding from ruins, they could have used that time and energy to expand their influence. Picture an Athens that never burned, the Acropolis intact, the Agora bustling with merchants from across the Mediterranean. Pericles wouldn't have needed to rebuild the city. He could have devoted his energies to expanding Athenian power and influence. The resources that went into reconstruction could have funded new colonies, new trade routes, new alliances. The golden age of Athens might have begun decades earlier and burned far brighter. The ripple effects would have spread far beyond Greece itself. With Persia humbled and in retreat, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean would have shifted dramatically. Greek merchants and colonists, no longer fearing Persian interference, might have pushed further east than ever before. Greek ideas about politics, philosophy, and science might have spread into regions that remained closed to them in our timeline. Consider the intellectual implications. The confidence boost from repelling the Persian invasion might have accelerated Greek philosophical and scientific development. Without the trauma of occupation and destruction, Greek thinkers might have felt freer to explore radical new ideas. The democratic experiment in Athens might have evolved faster and more boldly. Other city-states, inspired by Athens' success and Sparta's military glory, might have developed their own innovations in governance and society. The economic consequences would have been equally dramatic. Greece in 479 BCE would have been far wealthier and more populous than the Greece that actually emerged from the Persian Wars. This prosperity would have funded larger armies, bigger fleets, more ambitious building projects. The Parthenon might have had company from other architectural marvels that were never built because the resources went to war instead. But perhaps most intriguingly, a Persian defeat at Thermopylae might have prevented the internal conflicts that would later tear Greece apart. In our timeline, the success against Persia eventually led to Athenian dominance and the creation of the Delian League, which in turn sparked Spartan fear and resentment. The result was the devastating Peloponnesian War that left both superpowers exhausted and vulnerable. If Thermopylae had never fallen, that cycle of success, domination, and internal strife might never have begun. With Persia decisively repelled, and both Athens and Sparta sharing in the glory of victory, the two powers might have found common cause in exploiting their unexpected triumph. Rather than competing for leadership of Greece, they might have cooperated in expanding Greek influence eastward into the power vacuum left by Persian retreat. Think about what this would have meant for the development of Greek culture. In our timeline, the greatest achievements of classical Greece came during brief periods of peace between devastating wars. The Golden Age of Athens flourished in the decades after the Persian defeat, but was cut short by the Peloponnesian conflict. Imagine if that Golden Age had lasted not decades but centuries. If the resources spent on fratricidal warfare had instead gone toward philosophy, art, science, and exploration, the great schools of Athens would have had uninterrupted generations to develop their ideas. Socrates might not have been executed by a city traumatized by military defeat and political upheaval. Plato's academy could have flourished without the disruption of constant warfare. Aristotle might have had access to far more extensive libraries and research materials, perhaps accelerating scientific discovery by centuries, but the implications stretch far beyond the borders of Greece itself. A triumphant, unified Greek world would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of Mediterranean civilization. In our timeline, the Greek city-states eventually fell to the rising power of Rome, exhausted by their internal conflicts and unable to present a united front. But a Greece that had never been weakened by civil war, that had grown rich and powerful through decades of unopposed expansion, would have been a very different opponent for Roman ambitions. Picture Roman legions marching north, expecting to find the familiar patchwork of quarreling Greek cities, only to encounter a confederated Greek world with professional armies, abundant resources, and a well-deserved reputation for military excellence. The Romans were masters of divide and conquer, turning Greek states against each other to achieve victory. Against a united Greece flushed with victory over the Persian Empire, those tactics would have been useless. The Romans might never have expanded beyond Italy, or if they had, they might have been forced to develop as partners rather than conquerors, trading and negotiating with Greek powers rather than absorbing them. The entire character of what we call classical civilization might have been fundamentally different, shaped more by Greek democratic ideals than Roman imperial efficiency. This alternate path becomes even more intriguing when we consider the religious implications. In our timeline, the rise of Christianity occurred within the context of Roman political and cultural dominance. Greek philosophical ideas provided the intellectual framework, but Roman administrative systems and legal concepts shaped how the new faith spread and organized itself. Without Roman dominance, Christianity might have developed along very different lines, or might not have emerged at all in its familiar form. The Persian defeat at Thermopylae might have triggered a cascade of religious and cultural changes throughout the ancient world. Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Persian Empire, would have suffered a devastating blow to its prestige and influence. Local religious traditions, suppressed by Persian rule, might have experienced a revival. Greek religious and philosophical ideas, carrying the prestige of military victory, might have spread much further east than they actually did. Consider the fate of the Persian Empire itself in this scenario. A decisive defeat at Thermopylae wouldn't have just ended the Greek campaign. It would have shattered the fundamental basis of Persian imperial ideology. The Persian system was built on the concept of the great king as the chosen representative of Ahura Mazda, destined to rule all peoples and bring order to the world. A humiliating retreat from Greece would have called that entire worldview into question. The empire might have fragmented within decades rather than centuries. Egypt would almost certainly have rebelled, probably successfully. The eastern satrapies might have declared independence. Babylon might have attempted to restore its ancient autonomy. What had been the world's largest unified state might have split into a dozen competing kingdoms, each trying to claim legitimacy while lacking the overwhelming military power that had held the empire together. This fragmentation would have created opportunities for Greek expansion that never existed in our timeline. Greek mercenaries, traders, and colonists might have moved into former Persian territories not as subjects or reluctant allies, but as representatives of the civilization that had brought the mighty empire low. Greek cities might have been founded as far east as India, spreading Hellenic culture and political ideas across vast distances. The economic implications alone would have reshaped the ancient world. Persian control of trade routes between east and west had given the empire enormous wealth and leverage. With that control broken, Greek merchants might have established direct trading relationships with India and Central Asia. The wealth flowing into Greek cities would have funded even more ambitious projects of expansion and cultural development. But perhaps the most profound change would have been psychological and cultural. The Persian Empire represented something that was disappearing from the world by 480 BCE. It was the last of the great Bronze Age empires, built on concepts of divine kingship and absolute authority that stretched back to the earliest civilizations. Its defeat at Thermopylae would have marked not just a military victory, but the triumph of newer ideas about human organization and potential. Greek concepts of citizenship, political participation, and individual excellence would have spread without the interruption of Persian conquest or Roman absorption. The idea that ordinary people could participate in their own governance, that merit rather than birth should determine advancement, that human reason could understand and improve the world, these revolutionary concepts might have taken root across a much wider area much earlier in history. The ripple effects would have reached far beyond the Mediterranean. Trade routes that carried Greek goods and ideas might have extended the influence of Hellenic civilization deep into Africa and Asia. Greek mathematical and scientific knowledge, developing without the interruption of constant warfare, might have produced technological advances that could have accelerated human progress by centuries. Consider what this might have meant for the development of science and philosophy. Greek natural philosophers were already beginning to move away from purely mythological explanations of natural phenomena toward more systematic observation and reasoning. With greater resources, more stable political conditions, and contact with a wider range of cultures and ideas, this scientific revolution might have proceeded much more rapidly. Archimedes might have had access to Indian mathematical concepts centuries earlier than he actually did. Greek astronomers might have been able to establish observatories from Spain to India, dramatically improving their understanding of celestial mechanics. Greek physicians might have had access to medical traditions from across the known world, accelerating the development of medical knowledge and practice. The technological implications are staggering to contemplate. Steam power might have been developed in Alexandria rather than 18th century England. Precision navigation instruments might have enabled Greek explorers to reach the Americas long before Columbus. The printing press might have emerged from Greek scriptoriums rather than German workshops. But technology is only as powerful as the social and political systems that deploy it. Here, too, a world shaped by triumphant Greek ideals rather than Roman imperial efficiency might have developed along radically different lines. The Roman genius lay in administration, in creating systems that could govern vast territories with reasonable efficiency and stability. Greek genius lay in innovation, in questioning established assumptions and exploring new possibilities. A world dominated by Greek rather than Roman civilization might have been less politically stable but far more intellectually dynamic. Instead of the Roman preference for preserving and systematizing existing knowledge, we might have seen a culture that prized discovery and experimentation above all else. The result might have been a civilization that advanced much more rapidly in science and technology while remaining more politically fragmented and competitive. This fragmentation might actually have been beneficial for human progress. Competition between Greek city-states and their colonial offspring might have driven innovation in ways that the unified Roman system never could. Each city would have had incentives to develop new technologies, new forms of organization, new approaches to old problems, in order to maintain its independence and prosperity against its rivals. The military implications of this alternate timeline become particularly fascinating when we consider what might have happened when this dynamic Greek civilization encountered other expanding powers. In our timeline, Greek military innovations like the phalanx and siege engines eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world. In a timeline where Greek civilization had centuries more to develop without Roman interference, the military technologies and tactics available to Greek armies might have been far more advanced. By the time Greek expansion brought them into contact with emerging powers like the Parthians, the Germans, or the Chinese, they might have possessed decisive technological advantages. Greek fire might have been perfected centuries earlier. Greek metallurgy might have produced steel weapons and armor of unprecedented quality. Greek siege engines might have been capable of reducing any fortress. But perhaps more importantly, the Greek approach to warfare itself might have evolved in revolutionary directions. The citizen-soldier ideal, where free men fought for their own communities rather than serving as subjects of distant rulers, might have produced military forces with morale and effectiveness far exceeding anything seen in our timeline. So there you have it. One betrayal, one mountain path, one moment of weakness that changed everything. If Ephialtes had never revealed that goat trail, if those bronze shields had held firm for just a few more days, the world we know today might be unrecognizable. Democracy might have spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific centuries earlier. Science and philosophy might have advanced at breakneck speed. The very concept of individual liberty might have taken root across the globe long before the age of empires. But here's the thing about history. It's not just a collection of what-ifs and might-have-beens. It's a reminder that every moment, every decision, every act of courage or cowardice echoes through time in ways we can barely imagine. Those 300 Spartans didn't just fight for Greece. They fought for an idea. The radical notion that free people standing together could face down any tyranny. That idea survived their defeat. It lived on through Athens and Rome, through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right down to the world we inhabit today. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the noblest defeats. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's worth asking what might have been if things had gone differently at a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea.